Hello, and welcome to the first History Society presentation of the year. As you can no doubt see, this week's presentation is going to be on the Black and Tans. Now, some of you might be aware that Black and Tans is a form of police force involved in the British side in the Irish War of Independence, but beyond that, you might not be too sure. You might have heard some rumours, you might have seen the odd snippet, but you probably do not have a brilliant idea of exactly what the Black and Tans were. So, you're probably wondering, why is there a picture of these dogs? Well, this is because the name the Black and Tans itself derives from a Limerick fox hunting dog, this exact species, the beagle. Now, the association is the colours of the dogs. The original Black and Tans, them being police officers, there was a shortage of uniforms, so they had a mixture of both black police and khaki army uniforms. So Black and Tans, this led to the association colour-wise between them and the dogs, and the name stuck. You can also see some pictures of, on the top left, the auxiliaries, and on the top right, some members of the Black and Tans. Now, that's a bit, I could explain them, but it would make more sense just to get on with the next slide, and we'll come to them in a moment. So, the background. So you probably have a bit more of an awareness of the 1916 Irish Rebellion, the Easter Rising, but just for the sake of things, I'll go over the basics. So, at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, there was a growing feeling that Ireland should be more independent for home rule and Irish nationalism. The militant wing of this movement formed two notable forces. These were the Irish Volunteers, who were a militia force. They were the majority of the military force. They were the majority of the military forces at the disposal of the Republicans. You can see a picture of them on the top right. They had old equipment. They didn't really have a uniform. They didn't have brilliant training, so they were not the best of forces. However, there was a better trained force, this being the Citizens' Army. This had been formed by the socialist James Connolly as a means to protect the trade unions and the Irish workers. So, in 1916, there was a feeling among some members of the Irish Republican movement that now was the time for a rebellion. They didn't expect to succeed, but what they thought they should do was just show a sign that Irish republicanism was still alive. They took over key buildings across Dublin, including the GPO, which you can see on the bottom right, a focal point of the Rising. The event through the course of the Rising, it was destroyed, absolutely gutted with fire, leaving the shell of the building that you see there. Of the leaders, they were all captured, and several hundred prisoners were taken. However, the prisoners did not receive the response from the Dubliners that they'd expected. You can see them being marched off on the bottom left. They were pelted with food, with insults, because there was a feeling that these men were traitors. There were 200,000 Irishmen joined the British Army in the First World War, 200,000, and there was a feeling that these men had stabbed, that these Republicans had stabbed Ireland in the back. All seems to be well, the Rising has no support, but then the British military command in Dublin made the mistake of executing 14 of the 16 leaders, including James Connolly, as mentioned earlier, who most notably was executed tied to a chair, him being too injured to stand up for the normal form of firing squad execution. The only two individuals who survived were De Valera, the top centre, who survived on account of him being half American, having American citizenship, and Countess Markovich on the bottom, solely for the fact that she was a woman. Both of these characters went on to have a considerable involvement in Irish nationalism. So, there was now the complete change of public opinion. There'd been martyrs for a cause, and there was a feeling that if there are martyrs, there must be a cause worth fighting for. So, now go on to the fact that when the prisoners of the Rising were released in 1917, there was a completely different response to them. They were welcomed as heroes, they were seen as men who'd fought for Ireland as opposed to traitors, and you can see the contrast of the response here in this photo of a couple of the prisoners being released. So, in the general election of December 1918, there was incredible success for Sinn Féin, which was the party that those who'd been involved in the Rising came to be associated with. This party won 73 of the 105 Irish seats in Parliament, but all of them refused to take up their seats in Westminster, instead forming the Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament in Dublin. They invited other members of all other of the 105 Irish MPs to join them there to Westminster, but this was notably rejected by the Ulster Unionists of Ulster, Northern Ireland. However, with their own parliament, Irish separatism, Irish nationalism, and those willing to fight for it sped up. Key symbols of the British establishment, these being police stations and courthouses and tax officials, they became a focal point for attack, particularly around Cork and Kerry, the southern Ireland. You can see on the top centre picture of a burnt out police station. By the end of May 1920, there were a total of 351 evacuated police stations destroyed, 105 evacuated police stations damaged, 15 occupied police stations destroyed, and 25 occupied police stations damaged. That is a massive number, and it just illustrates the almost universal feeling in Ireland of opposition to the British. The British soldiers were used in collaboration with the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force, to try and deal with the risings by arresting senior members of Sinn Féin, senior volunteers who became around this time the Irish Republican Army, and to confiscate guns. However, what was seen as nighttime raids and checkpoints, as you can see an example of the centre to the right, led to riots and opposition to this, a picture which you can see the bottom centre left. Also, the increased attempts by the Irish Republican Army to seize weapons from police stations, not simply to destroy them. They also tried to take weapons from Coast Guard stations, explosives, signalling equipment. So they weren't just attacking any sign of British establishment just because. They were doing it almost tactically. They were trying to take items that could help them. They eventually moved from just being simple rebels to what became flying squads. You can see a picture on the bottom left. These were units who moved around the country as opposed to just attacking directly in their local area, which made it easy for them to attack a police convoy and then move somewhere else to avoid any reprisals or attempts to capture them. Around this time, the only key member of the Irish to lead the Irish Republican Army was Michael Collins, who you can see on the bottom right. What was notable was his skills for organisation, for planning, for keeping records under informants. This is almost entirely down to the fact that he had received training in the British General Post Office, so in effect, he had the skills of a British civil servant, a very capable one. This helped him, and he was able to form what became known as the Squad. So while most of the volunteers were prepared to fire at policemen and throw a firebomb through a window, Michael Collins was able to find men who were fully prepared to carry out assassinations, to more specialist work. These men, just a few hundred, were able to cause much of the British authorities in Dublin very concerned for there to be almost a martial law around the castle, the amount of security that had to be put in to protect them. You can see on the top right examples of British soldiers just on the roofs of Dublin in an attempt to try and counter these this violence, which of course is very difficult to do, as the terrorists, as they were called at the time, looked just the same as any other normal civilian. So, with an increased number of resignations from the Royal Irish Constabulary and recruitment among the Irish, almost completely drying up, there was a real fear that simply by a shortage of police officers, the Irish nationalists will get what they wanted. In some parts of the country where the police had to completely evacuate and the courts no longer sat, the IRA were able to establish their own police force and own courts, which had their pluses and negatives. Unionists who tried to escape often were given a fair price for their land, but at the same time, suspected spies dealt with very harshly. So, there was a decision around March 1920 to try and bolster the RIC through recruitment from Britain. However, the problem was that with the recruitment, the rapid recruitment, that supplies couldn't keep up of clothes, of jackets, of trousers, of belts. So there became a bit of a mishmash. This contrasting colours is really what is why they became known as the Black and Tans. As I said in the first slide, they look somewhat like the famous Hound Pack in Limerick. So, they were officially part of the Irish police force. This is something to take note. They were not separate from the RIC. They were just there was a special drive to recruit them. Eventually, as the uniform and organisation problems were smoothed out, it was, at least by appearance, impossible to tell a member of the RIC from a member of the Black and Tans. However, problems soon rose. The drastic need to fill up the police meant that the Black and Tans were given a very simplified course. They were given 2, at the most 3 weeks of police training. This did not cover any of the guerrilla activity they're going to be fighting against. It was just the most simple terms of police work, so they were not given even a basic training. Also, the Black and Tans were mainly recruited, a third from London and a third from Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester, and also, surprisingly, 20% from Ireland. So, on the whole, this meant that the majority of the men had a harsher upbringing, probably more working class. On the whole, most of them were ex-servicemen, having seen combat in the First World War, but they were by no means suited for police work. They'd been fighting against an obvious enemy for 4 years, and it was a sudden contrast to now be fighting terrorists who they didn't know where they were just blending into the population. There became discipline issues after attacks on convoys, such as the original picture of a convoy you see there on the bottom right. You can see they're just in open-top vehicles, there's no protection, it's very easy to shoot at them. Often these attacks would kill 1, injure 2 or 3, but after these, it was very common that there'd be reprisals, particularly with the Black and Tans. This would involve descending on the nearest town, smashing up the town hall, smashing up the local public house, of course, after liberating most of its contents. Often large local areas of employment, such as creameries, they were burnt to the ground. So this created a hostility, which in itself then meant people were more likely to attack the Black and Tans, and so it just became a vicious loop. There were several notable attacks and outrages as they became known. These are in Kilkee in 26th September, Trim 27th September, Granada 31st of October. They just kept on coming. However, the worst of all attacks was the attack on Cork, the burning of Cork. You can see a colorized image on the bottom left. This was the major city of the area, and as you can see, Cork was absolutely gutted. It was burnt to the ground, the centre of it at least. It reminded reporters of burnt out French cities after 3 years of war. Though it was a combined problem, it became, the reason it was so bad, it was a release of frustration for the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, even the army and the normal police. When the fire brigade turned up, their hoses were often sabotaged. There were no real coordinated efforts among the senior authorities to deal with these Black and Tans, to deal with the fires, I mean. But one of the reasons this might have been is that there, around 1920, there was an attack. One police station was so angry with the circumstances they were under and with how poorly they felt they were being supported, that there was a minor mutiny. They refused to carry out their police work. So the British commander for the RIC turned up, and what he said was shocking, and when reported in newspapers, caused great fuss. I can't read the whole thing, it's quite long, but the important point was that he said, "You may occasionally make mistakes, and innocent persons may be shot, but that cannot be helped, and you're bound to get the right parties at some time. The more you shoot, the more I'll like you, and I assume you that no policeman will get into trouble for shooting any man." Not only is that absolutely shocking, he's telling the police to shoot men as they will not be getting into trouble for it. It was recognised as such by the normal RIC. After that speech, 5 constables immediately resigned. So you can see that among the Black and Tans, they feel that they're almost being given permission to carry out their own form of justice on what they see as terrorists, whereas normal members of the RIC, even more so, they're being isolated in the local communities, people won't talk to them, people won't offer them services, they're being attacked, threatened, so they are really being given no real incentive to stay and remain as policemen. Now, there was, of course, an awareness that the IRA were being very successful in their attacks, and so the cabinet, there was a decision that they should create a more specialist unit to try and deal with the attacks that were being faced. These were the auxiliaries. Often in news reports, it's confused with auxiliaries being given the blanket term Black and Tans. Eventually, the Black and Tans, it became indistinguishable from the police, and the term Black and Tans is, even to this day, used as a blanket term for all British forces in the Irish War of Independence. The difference between the auxiliaries and Black and Tans, well, similarities is they were both recruited specially to deal with Ireland. Differences, there's plenty. The auxiliaries were paramilitary units. They were policemen of a sort, but they were armed. They weren't there to carry out normal policing work. It was their sole job to really take the battle to the Irish Republican Army. They were to carry out their own ambushes. They were to really try and make the IRA feel threatened. They were recruited solely among officers. There was an expectation to recruit about 8,000, although numbers never went above 1,600. The problem was that they were often sent to, they were sent to areas where there was great IRA activity, as I said, the south. But once they were there was a reluctance among police chiefs to use them. This wasn't what police chiefs had been trained to do. So auxiliary just became an independent force unto their own. They carried out what they saw as fair reprisal attacks when it was felt suitable, but they became noted through the IRA for their efficiency. They became known as the Invincibles, to quote one IRA commander, but that didn't mean that they were entirely efficient. You can see in the centre bottom that they too carry out atrocities, this poor lady having rescued all the furniture she can from her burning house after an auxiliary attack. Also see the bottom right, crossley tenders, vehicles in which the auxiliaries drove around the country in to shoot at people who they suspected of just being black and tans. As I said earlier, there was a feeling that it was fine for the police and the auxiliaries, by extent, to carry out such reprisals. However, if you look at the picture on the bottom left, showing mainly a gathering of auxiliaries, but also a few members of the Black and Tans, you probably notice that the officer in the centre has a different coloured uniform. This is because he is a member of the RAF and has kept his old uniform. If you were to look up pictures of the auxiliaries, you'll see they are a real hodgepodge. They wear overcoats, they wear jackets, they wear trench coats. The only real piece of universal uniform is the Balmoral beret that they so notably wear, as you can see again on the top right. Return to the fact of the RAF, there was, although officers for their origin evenly spaced over England, they often were more proportionately, there were more members of the RAF in than there should have been, but there were also a lower proportion of naval officers than you would have expected by proportion of how large they were. That perhaps demonstrates that maybe there wasn't as many opportunities for former aerial officers when they were demobilised, but that's by the by. The whole fact of the matter was that they were a unit of ex-officers who it was assumed would act efficiently, gallantly, and would really ensure that the war was won for the British. Their only real notable victory, you might say, was on 25th of May 1921, when the IRA took over the Customs House in Dublin. This was the records of Ireland for centuries back. There was a feeling that this was where oppression was centred. This is where people were taxed. This was a very large thing to pull for the IRA to take over a building in the centre of Dublin, but they felt, given the victories they'd been having up to this point, they could do it. However, this was, even though there were 100 members of the IRA, this was just the sort of combat that auxiliaries had been trained for. An enemy in a fortified position who were there. They weren't running through hedges. It was obvious who were the opponents. You can therefore see a picture in the centre right, the centre of the right side, of them approaching the Customs House. The auxiliaries were very effective. 18 men taken prisoner, 5 shot, and just a few escaping. So although the records were completely burnt, although some which therefore achieved the IRA's aim, we can see that at least if they were to be used in the way that they've been trained for, the auxiliaries were an effective force. However, the treaty between Britain and Ireland was signed in 1921. The treaty signing party from Ireland, led by Michael Collins, with De Valera, the man I mentioned as being one of those who survived the 1916 Rising, having for the most of the war been travelling around America trying to raise money for the Republican campaign. So with the treaty, British forces to withdraw. As you can see, bottom left, last of some British soldiers writing their goodbye messages on the door of their barracks, but the British were to give what became Southern Ireland independence, while Ulster, Northern Ireland, remained part of the United Kingdom, as it still does. The one difference was that Britain was to keep 3 naval ports, but these have since had to be given back. However, peace did not come about. Although I don't have time to delve into it, there was then the Irish Civil War, which by all accounts was a more brutal war than the Irish War of Independence. It's partly believed this because there was most of those who'd fought in the War of Independence were a bit nervous for the violence, they weren't used to it. But when it came to the Civil War, to them, violence was fine. They were no longer held back by moral boundaries. You can see artillery firing and battle raging in Dublin, as it did for Customs House in 1916, rising in the top right, and you can see the damage done to Dublin in the middle. So as you can see, if anything, the situation got worse. Also, Michael Collins, the director of intelligence, who had led so effectively the IRA campaign, he was assassinated as the Civil War was coming to an end. However, the notable thing, though, is that at his funeral, not only were there 500,000 people, which at the time was 20% of Ireland's population, but also there was a notable number of British soldiers who at the time were still withdrawing from the country, which is notable because that shows that even though this had been a man who'd led the campaign against them and had organised men to shoot their officers and their fellow countrymen, they didn't feel any bitterness to him. They felt that he had been a suitable adversary, someone who had fought in an understandable manner, which in itself is interesting. But to return to the main focus of the presentation, the Black and Tans, as the RIC was disbanded, they by default were disbanded. However, a few hundred of them then went on to join the Royal Ulster Constabulary, so the police force in Northern Ireland, while a few thousand joined might be 1,000 actually, anyway, a large amount joined the police force in Mesopotamia, where coincidentally Tudor, the leader of the auxiliaries, also went. So this demonstrates that although the war had ended, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries were disbanded, those who were involved were still prepared to commit violence, to carry out work as police, which is interesting considering the very hard time they'd had in the Irish War of Independence, that they still felt they would be able to carry out the role as police officers. So that's this presentation of the Black and Tans, and the auxiliaries, of course. Hope you've enjoyed it and quite possibly you've learned something. Thank you.